Lake Peipsi is the fifth biggest freshwater body in Europe. Okay, here. Body in Europe, and the area of kilometers is 3,555 square kilometers. This is very shallow lake. Generally, mean depth is 7.1 meter, and it is had a trophical status, and the catchment area is approximately 47,000 square kilometers big. It's almost like territory of Estonia. No? Okay. Lake Peipsi has been locally valued for its rich production for many centuries. You can see here the situation, what was in on different provinces, how it was divided, Lake Peipsi, between different provinces of Russian Empire. And Russian fishers on the eastern coast of Lake Peipsi were aware for its rich fish stocks already in the Middle Ages, and they settled on the northern coast of Lake Peipsi. But when the provinces of Estland and Livland became a part of the Russian Empire, it was 1710. Russian fishermen started to emerge also along the lake's western coast, what was dry and nice to be fished, and the east coast was more swampy and was not so comfortable for fishing. The first one, the decline of the sizes of fishes and fish stocks in Lake Peipsi was mentioned in the 18th century. It was the 1770 by one clerical man who wrote this paper, what is the right side to see. And in the province of Livland, the local nobility was at the beginning of the 19th century very much alarmed because of the massive catch of juvenile fish younger than 1 year old. This is total length of 3 and 6 centimeters. And the first fishing restrictions in Livland were introduced in 1825. However, the surrounding provinces like Estland and St. Petersburg and Pskov were not following this example. These restrictions were in power only in province of Livland. And now I'm coming to Karl-Ernst von Baer. Von Baer is internationally well-known natural scientist in the 19th century. He discovered the Mammal movement. He created a comparative embryology as science. He was in the roots of the permafrost science in the world. He was very active in natural protection questions, in physical anthropology, etc., etc. He was called, after Alexander von Humboldt was dead, as Nordic Humboldt in Russia, in Western Europe. And he was very active in fishing questions too, because his embryology work in 1920s, and the aim of the world first special fishery expedition 1851-52 to Lake Peipsi. It was led by von Baer, who was to assess the abundance of fish stocks in the lake and develop common rules for fishing surrounding the lake in order to guarantee the fisheries sustainability. It was the main question, or it was interesting field for Baer for many, many years. And what came out? What were the results of the expeditions? Yearly catches of smelt, it was the most common for that time, was 18,400 tons per year. And in the yearly catch of juvenile fish of different species, almost bream, roach, ruff, and perch, was 994 tons in 1851. A smaller scale study also included pendants, Peipsi whitefish, eel, pike, and bream catches, but Bear did not succeed in obtaining respective statistics for the whole lake. As the available data collected by von Bear show, the amount of fish caught from Peipsi per year in the 1850s was approximately 22,000 tons. And to protect the fishes and different species, Bear proposed to ban the catch of juvenile fish, as well as any disturbance of fish during sporing. The new fishing laws were enforced by the Russian Emperor in December 1859. They were the first laws in Russian Empire signed by Bear in natural protection or fishing protection. The new regulations were not strictly followed by the local fishers, and the law was very difficult to control because the local policeman had to do, but the local policeman was totally depending on these fishermen. And of course, they couldn't control this, not so as it was needed. And the main species, what was caught was lake smelt, and the Russians loved it very much, and it was sold in greatest amounts. Consumers in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Pskov, and they were tried. Here is to see the smelt drying ovens, and every oven was important for possible to every day to dry 60 kilograms, or you have as a result 60 kilograms dried lake smelt. And during the Bear's time, such ovens were surrounding of the Lake Peipsi 800. That's a very big amount. Here is to see types of different nets used in different areas around Lake Peipsi and Lake Pskov by data on 1913. And here is to see that the southern part of what is called the Lake Pskov, and the middle one, what is Lake Chopler, there was distributed almost smelt nets, and smelt set nets and traps. And even on the southern part of Lake Peipsi. But on the northern part, there were distributed set nets for Vendans. Vendans was distributed there, and the south was smelt almost. But as you can see, everywhere were used different types of hooks, and there are drawings from Bear's time. One his expedition member did them, and the Sikushka and Okunevka, they were so well developed hooks. They are in use today too. Nothing is changed compared to the 19th century. After von Bear, the overfishing continued, and the years 1912 and 1914, full Peipsi Lake was systematically studied by Russian scientific commercial fishery expedition. The fishing gear and the methods, you can see here the different photos, were essentially the same as in the von Bear time. And the main target species were smelt, Vendans, and the Peipsi whitefish, what was the new one. Totally, 42,000 people were depending on fishing on Lake Peipsi. During the Bear time, they were 25,000 people. But the fishermen were not eager to deliver information about the catches. And even when von Bear could have some numbers, then from this expedition are not available, no numbers, how high were catches in that time. But the expedition was preparing new fishing laws, but then started the World War I, and of course everything collapsed, and Estonia became independent. In Russia came on the power Bolsheviki, and nothing for two. And only in 1931, Estonia starts again the fishery statistics. I don't know if in Russia, and it was not existing at that time. And these commercial fishing statistics collect from fishers by the state authorities are then available in the before this Second World War and after Second World War until now. And here you can see, although this variability of catches, yearly catches, commercial fishes, is very variable, then decreasing of amount of catches is very clear. And when we compare, during von Baer's time, the lake's annual fish yield was estimated as 65 kilograms per hectare. Then in 1930s, it was declined to 33 kilograms per hectare, and now it's only 50. It's decreasing, is very clear, and so on. And what are the reasons here? Of course, the one reason is the climate change, and until the 1980s, dominated smelt and wendans as cool water species, as it was in the 19th century. Then now pike perch, and bream, more tolerant for warm water bodies, are dominating now nowadays. And unfortunately, the smelt is to see as blue, and the red one is wendans. And now more tolerant species like pike perch and perch are dominating. And what is the reason why it happens? First, longer periods with water temperature over 20 degrees in summer are growing. How has measured in most meteorological station on the western coast of Lake Peipsi. Secondly, during the last 50 years, especially extreme weather events like heat waves and associated fish kills during cyanobacterial blooms, for example, 1972 smelt kills, not smelt anymore, and then wendans kill in 1989 seems to be the overwhelming stressors of fish populations and fishery in Lake Peipsi. Third, the shared tolerant species like pike perch, and bream in total catch, which average 16% in 1931-1940, has increased to 76 in the years 2010 and 2018. In the same time, the share of cool water species like smelt, wendans, Peipsi whitefish, and purport in total declined from 47% of total catch in 1931-1940 to 4% in 1910 until 2010-2018. Even Cheung and Daniel Pooley published in 2013 a big article on, they are ocean biologists in Nature, and they calculate the mean temperature of catch. It means that every species had the preferred temperature where they are living, fish species. When the temperature is higher or lower, they are disappearing or looking for new territories. And even when we calculated mean temperature of the catch for different species on the Lake Peipsi. And for wendans, it is the 8 degrees. For Peipsi whitefish, and the 10 degrees. For light smelt is the 11.3. And for example, for pike perch, it is 17. For European perch is the 17 degrees too, and for rough is 21 degrees. And as we see, then the MTC values can be split, as this is a main result of our research, can be split into two sharply different periods. The first period from 1931 until 1986 is showing that there is a variability is very high, but the mean temperature of the catch has been in 14.5 degrees, but the second period from the 1937 to nowadays, the significant increase is taking part. It is 0.08 degree Celsius per year, and it means that the MTC has during the second period grown until 16 degrees. Then the MTC, this mean temperature of the catch since the late 1980s, exhibits at the steadily upward trend, the overall picture resembling the hockey stick figure. It's very nice to see. What is very typical of global warming studies. Although this is very shallow lake and very different from East China Sea and many other seas, what Cheung and Daniel Bowley has studied the mean temperature of the catch. I mean the freshwater bodies is almost the same result, and this MTC is the first time calculated for the one freshwater body. Earlier has been this not done. And now, thank you for your attention. This is everything what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So next paper will move on to land and quite far from Lake Peipsi, because our next presentation is by Victoria Peemot, and she's a PhD candidate at the University of Helsinki. She has actually just submitted her dissertation on Tuvan horse culture, but her paper today is about her next project, and which will assess the Finnish geological expedition to Central Asia in early 20th century, in 1970. So Victoria's paper today is titled A Geological Expedition as the Multispecies Venture. Please go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you. My name is Victoria. I start with that, and I am very glad for this opportunity to talk about my future postdoctoral research project. It's about Finnish geological expedition to Tuva, my homeland, in 1917. And I am especially pleased today that people who are also interested and also study together with me this expedition's heritage are present. It's Ingrid Svanfeld and Carl Johan Linden. Carl Johan is son of one of that historical expedition members. And we have been collaborating on this project since 2013. And I am also glad to see geologist Leonid Kolbantsev from St. Petersburg, who studies research of one of the expedition members, Helge Backlund. Yes, a geological expedition is the multi-species venture. Maybe it's a little bit puzzling title, but if we think about the past expedition or research in the past, it's always a cooperation with between different species. Because during this 1917 expedition in Tuva, geologists had to rely on horses as their pack and transport means, and some of them, for example, Helge Backlund in 1909 had a big expedition to the polar Ural area, and he used also reindeer. And here I will introduce briefly the geography. We can see Tuva Republic. It is in Inner Asia, north of Mongolia. And top left, you can see the, and this map is from the book by the expedition member Håkon Kran. And this area on the contemporary map would be around, roughly around River Kahem, this area, and then it will go to the southeast to include this Lake Herinur or Terefel today, and they circled here. So the headquarters were in Chlebnikova. Chlebnikova is the small village in the upper stream of the Kahem River, named after its owner, Russian farmer. And the 1917 expedition had own headquarters there, and they made, in different groups, they made trips around this area exploring. I will start with research methodologies because they define what and where I study. First of all, I rely on the archive of this 1917 expedition. It's very rich visual archive, consists of hundreds of photographs and text include diaries, correspondence, private letters sent from Tuva or alongside the road to their family in Europe, and of course, multiple publications in different languages. And they were very observant. And for example, they left observation about nature, climate, different plant and animal species. So it's a very rich source on human-animal relationships. And since 2013, but more actively since 2015, I've been conducting ethnographic fieldwork in the areas where this expedition worked previously. And I have collected some audio interviews and also recorded video interviews talking with local people about their homeland, about showing them these photographs from 1917 and discussing the past and history of those places, because the history, of course, was very drastic, considering all the events of the last century. And starting with sentient non-humans, animals, and homeland. I talk about it in my dissertation more because I rely on indigenous storytelling with homelands and non-human animals like horses to talk about memory politics and identity negotiations in post-Soviet Tuva. And on this photograph, you can see Kenneth Frede in Chlebnikova, and photograph is by Erik Linden. And there is one of the photo cameras they had in 1917 in Tuva. So, okay, my large postdoctoral research project involves all the heritage of this expedition and different thematic groups. But for this presentation, I kind of separated more like related to the animals topics. For example, for me, it's particularly interesting topic is cooperation with horses in the mountains, because I haven't had myself this kind of experience. I am a rider, I can ride horses. I was brought up in this kind of herding environment, but still 3-4 months long expeditions in the mountains with kind of difficult terrain, horseback is something which is I would love to explore more. And then also valuable observations on presence and use of domesticated animals in Tuva. For example, the expedition 1917 members mentioned camel caravans bringing goods from the from south, meaning Mongolia and China. And soon after that, of course, Chinese traders were trade with China was replaced by a trade with Russia, and the southern roads were closed for trading. And also, for example, Sederholm, a little bit north of Kahem River, he met reindeer herders. Today, reindeer herders live more north from this area, which is currently occupied by Russian old believers. And then when I was reading these diaries of the expedition members, I have noticed how much they mention different animals, like wild species. Okay, they hunted also, but they also describe some local food, some venison or some deer meat they were offered. And one particular interesting topic is also history of farming of red deer. I wanted to write Servosolafus, but ethnobiologist Ingvar Svanberg from Uppsala University corrected me, saying that today researchers prefer the Servus canadensis sibiricus name, but I don't want to get involved in these taxonomical arguments. So yes, and this lake is Herinur or Terefel today, and these two photographs are taken from one direction west to east, and just the new photograph is taken from closer to the lake position. And it's still considered a remote area. There is still no direct car road from central Tuva to this region. This is one of the examples of encounters with wild species, and the caption, the original caption says that this is a black squirrel. The animal is not melanistic, so they are referring to the species, but there is not, of course, documented evidence that somebody saw the fox squirrels in Tuva. Yeah, perhaps kind of editing this photograph will help to see which species exactly it is. And here, Erki Linden is trying to pull down this branch, a bird that he hunted. And on these two photographs, we can see the same bird gun that Erki Linden used in Tuva. Here one on Erki has it, and here next to the tree. And the gun was made by this master Nikolai Kumanen from Kakitsalny, which is currently Priazovsk in Russia. And it's another interesting topic, what kind of weapons the expedition members had. It's, okay, obviously this bird gun, but also they had several Mosin rifles from the Imperial Gun Factory in Sestroretsk, next to St. Petersburg, and they bought them there. Yes, and the Winchester also there was. But an interesting thing that at the time there was some kind of restriction on sale of rifles in Russia, including Tuva, and it was also an illegal trade in rifles. But these rifles all came back to Europe. And in the archive of the expedition, there are several photographs from this marl farm in Hlebnikovo. The Russian farmers who moved to Tuva from the Altai area, they brought marl farming with them and marls. So by 1915, there were like several marl farms in Tuva. Here we can see, for example, there is a report by a Russian agronomist Turchaninov from 1915, and he says that there are several farms owned only by Russian farmers in northeastern regions of Pozhu and Kahen in Tuva. And there is Chinese and Russian traders who come during the antlers cutting season to buy them. And they had some kind of competition between them, but somehow they ruled out so that the Russian traders would buy from the local producers in Tuva and bring those antlers to Chinese traders, to Minusins. Yes, and Turchaninov also lamented that people don't try actually to raise those marals in captivity because they're keeping only the males and there are no female. And there is 1931 census where we can see that the number of marals is dropping, most of them now in the state farms. And this is the census, and we can see marals here in one line with livestock, horses, sheep, goats, marals, and pigs. The hunting animals, game animals, they go in a different list. And today, okay, in 2014, one government subsidized the opening of this new maral farm to run. They bought more than 200 animals from the Altai Republic. Roughly half of them were females, and then males and young animals. And it seems like they're kind of growing rapidly. And it's interesting also that, yeah, so they define it like the Altai Soyan breed. The same agronomist Turchaninov plus several Russian ethnographers actually mentioned different ways of capturing marals or keeping them later in these farms. For example, they use this marali dvor in Russian, an enclosure with 2 entrances or a small log cabin with a falling door, and of course a pit to capture them. But it's also interesting for me in light of these recent studies on human-animal relationship. For example, architectures of relationship. David Anderson, an anthropologist, talked about architectures of relationship in the context of the Arctic reindeer herders. And here we can see that this maral enclosure is very high. It's about 6 meters probably. And no domesticated species need this high structure to keep them inside. So clearly it's for the wild species. And another interesting point for future research for me is an intersection of this maral farming in Tuva and traditional attitudes towards the maral or the red deer among herder hunters in Tuva. So this is an old herder hunter, my informant from the same Terinur or Terehol lake area. We have seen those photographs of the lake before. And so I have met him twice in 2014 and 2015, and he explained me that maral or the red deer is one of the great animals, thus meaning that it's a respected animal. For example, another great animal is a bear. Yes, and because it is a respected animal, they would prefer name it as by an euphemism. Sarva, the yellow wild animal. Is, yeah, it's a wild animal. And then he also explained me that he used these 3 methods of hunting when he was younger. One of them is ILR, is using a crossbow aya. And it was used in winter, but today it's forbidden, of course, because it's not safe. And then Hayırmanar is basically kind of widespread method, I guess, just waiting at the place with salt, and it's used in summer. And then Kaygırpangnar is a very popular one today in Tuva. They use special pole, the instrument, murgu or amurga. There are 2 different names in different dialects in Tuva. And it's used only during the mating season, which is the second part of September. Okay, and thank you. And if you are interested in the larger project, please welcome to my another presentation in frames of this month, Environmental Humanities Month, which will take place in November 23rd. Yes, and here are my thanks to Carl Johan, to Ingvar Svander, and funding foundations. And this is also one of my favorite parts of this research, to compare photographs of the same places from 1917 and from today. These are Argo River Valley or Harhingol in the 1917 photograph. Thank you.
Okay, so our third presenter is Dr. Anastasia Fedotova, and she comes from the Institute for the History of Science and Technology, the Russian Academy of Science in St. Petersburg, but of course we are happy to have her in Helsinki at the moment, and she's a visiting Kone Fellow at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. And I think she has cooperated with Dr. Tomasz Samojlik from Poland on this paper. Please go ahead, Anastasia.
Thank you. Let's move back to the 19th century and to big animals. The thesis that the population of big animals were first to extinct due to the anthropogenic pressure is a common ground for conservation science. Nevertheless, some species of big mammals still survived even in the region with intensive hunting and agriculture. This story is already told for such iconic species as European bison or ibex. I would like to dig into a story of a present-day relatively common species, European deer, Servosolafus. This species is quite common now, but it came to the brink of extinction in the 18th and 19th century. It survived due to the two totally different categories of the habitats. The first type were the natural refugia in the mountains, and the second time were at least as the same importance, the protected hunting ground of European high aristocracy. Within this project, we aim to show the role of those aristocratic hunting grounds for surviving the red deer in the Russian Empire in the long 19th centuries. And you remember that by the eve of World War I, it included nowadays Finland, Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, Crimea, and good share of Poland and Caucasus. This presentation is work in progress, and by this moment, it's more about questions than answers. Before the intensive agriculture colonization or during medieval climate optimum, this is an important point since the harsh winter has the same negative impact on the European red deer population as overhunting does. The range of Servosolafus reached the Urals. Do you see the arrow? Further to the east, another species of red deer, 12, Cervus canadensis, it is often called wapiti or marl. All European, Siberian, Caucasian, Central Asian, American, and so on subspecies perfectly hybridize with each other, and these confuse the discussion about natural ranges of different Cervus species. All taxonomic issues are even more confusing due to the numerous artificial translocation made over the last 3 centuries. There is no already data on when Servosolafus went extinct or was exterminated in particular part of the European, East European plain. The methods of hard science do not allow to date this event with the accuracy that is needed for us as historians. It means that we should use historical sources. For the 19th century, it would mean, first of all, hunting and forestry literature, and as well as some archival source. For a number of reasons, the most complete data series that we were able to found for the long 19th century are the data on Białowieża imperial hunting ground. Fragmentary data on other hunting grounds allows us to say that the Białowieżan trends were quite typical for other hunting grounds. The only exception in sense of ready data on Servosolafus population during the last 5 centuries is the northeastern part of the present-day Poland. It's a PhD dissertation of Magda Niedzielkowska. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the red deer dwelled and was hunted in Białowieża forest and in some other woods. In Białowieża forest, red deer was exterminated or did not survive harsh winters of the Little Ice Age, but most likely both factors played its role. And by during 18th century, it had disappeared almost through the whole territory of the present-day Poland. Only small herds have survived in the woods of what we would rather call Eastern Prussia. However, even in these strictly protected forests by early 19th century, the total population dropped to about 200. As for other places in Eastern Europe. After a few months of reading hunting papers of 19th century, I can tell with good share of confidence that the only places within the borders of the Russian Empire where wild Servosolafus still dwelt were Caucasus and Crimea mountains. But despite to the fact that for the most part of the 19th century, the red deer was absent on the Eastern European plain, and that the most of the landowners do not have the slightest chance to hunt for it, still red deer was an important symbol of hunting. For example, red deer or its antler were almost the mandatory element of cover of hunting magazines or coats of arms of the hunting societies. Why was the red deer considered to be such an important symbol? The straight answer, Western European fashion, does not explain everything. But the way how hunting, and not only hunting, literature describes the red deer helps a lot. An adult male red deer is a large, very beautiful animal, and the adjective noble were used a lot. They were very smart and very cautious. Many articles in hunting magazine explains how difficult it is to track down and kill the animal. Other deer species, for example, roe deer or fallow deer, were considered not as smart and cautious, and they are much easier to kill. A red deer is difficult trophy, and in the same types not as dangerous as brown bear or wild boar. Let's add tasty meat, valuable pelts, beautiful antlers, and just an ideal game species. Because of differentiation and population growth by the early 19th century, the aristocracy could no longer just hunt big game in a nearby forest. Instead, it would be necessary to maintain a specialized infrastructure, to hire personnel for game management, to protect forest from unauthorized users, to provide winter additional feeding, even to fence some part of forests, to create deer parks or hunting gardens, and at least in the 18th century Russian Empire, to transport red deer from elsewhere. The earliest red deer park within the border of the Russian Empire on which I found data was Gatchina Imperial Residency in the vicinity of St. Petersburg. But Gatchina Deer Park had no effect on the local red deer population, since red deer is not able to survive harsh winters without human assistance. The significance of Gatchina enclosures for the history of red deer as a species is limited by its role as transition point, only as a place from which other hunting grounds received animals. And their population was not that big. The numbers for Białowieża forest are much more impressive, few thousands in the early 20th century. What is more important, present-day Białowieża red deer are the descendants of deer that were brought there more than 100 years ago. The same applies to other aristocratic hunting grounds in the lowlands of Central and East European places. Documents show that the red deer were brought from distant places. The present-day Białowieża red deer are descendants of deer from Silesia, Austria, Baden-Württemberg, and probably of Wapiti from an unknown region. Other hunting grounds could get deer also from Caucasus, Siberia, or even from America. Game management was very intense. I am presenting you some data on Białowieża, but in other parks, management could be even more intense. Along with the deer from remote places, a new parasite and disease were introduced to the region. High density on feeding points meant that disease and parasites would be easy to spread. Additional winter feeding consisted often of forage that was not very regular for the wild animal, and it is quite possible that it could trigger some shifts in system of digestive enzymes. The behavior of red deer was probably affected because of absence of predators and constant presence of humans. We have just named a few issues related only to one species. A similar story can be told about many other game species, roe deer, wild boar, pheasants, etc., etc. Europeans not only brought their game species to other continents, they moved European species within Europe with great intensity. The last funny fact, in some regions, there was even a special tariff to transport deer by rail. So special money for man, special tariff for horse, for dog, and for deer. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Miko. I'm honored to be invited to participate in this panel. By way of background, today's talk comes out of the early stages of two book projects. One is The Consumer Culture of American Hunting Since the Civil War, and the second is a more protean project, A History of White-tailed Deer in the United States. So again, that's at the very early stages, but this is a bit of work out of that. If you're not intimately familiar with whitetail as a species, Mark may give you a little more background, I don't know. But white-tailed deer populations were super abundant in the years surrounding renewed contact between the Old World and the New. Estimates as to exact populations vary widely, but a generally accepted sort of middle figure is that there were probably 30 million white-tailed deer in North America around the year 1600. And whitetail were the most numerous of large game species in the eastern half of North America. And they were, of course, of great cultural and economic importance for many Native American peoples. But the combination of an enormous, long-standing hide trade, steady subsistence and market hunting for venison, and habitat change driven by settler agriculture led to a low point in deer populations by about the year 1900. At that point in time, there were perhaps just 300,000 animals remaining on the continent. But by the late 1800s, there were already restoration efforts underway. These initiatives came from multiple places. Initially, they were often driven by private individuals and private sportsmen's clubs, but that was soon amplified by the voices of a number of editors of popular sporting magazines, and then came to involve various state game agencies and forestry departments, especially after the year 1900. The most notable early effort along these lines of whitetail restoration came in the state of Vermont. There in the Green Mountain State, deer had been extirpated shortly after the American Civil War. But reintroduction efforts began in the late 1870s. These were successful enough that a deer hunting season was reopened in 1896 and expanded rapidly in the years thereafter. And Vermont came to be seen as something of a model for whitetail recovery in the US. Its various techniques were replicated first in adjoining New England states and then more distantly. And a key part of Vermont's restoration plan was what they called a buck law. And this was a piece of game legislation that forbid the killing of any white-tailed deer but mature males. So the buck law was adopted by other states that were intent on following this Vermont plan. 19 states in total by 1916 had buck laws on the books, and a few additional states would adopt the law in the decade that followed. Indeed, most states that had held native whitetail populations ended up with a buck law to complement other restoration efforts, such as restocking. This is a later slide. This is from the late 1840s, I believe, in Illinois, showing some restocking efforts. Just as important, private, state, and federal game managers conducted a sustained sort of PR campaign during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, designed to educate hunters on the necessity of buck laws and the ethics of deer hunting as they related to the animal's sex. For example, Henry Chase, who had served as a Vermont game warden, labeled any hunter who wanted to kill more than a single buck in a season, quote, a game hog or mercenary butcher. Famed conservationist William Hornady made a prohibition on doe hunting part of his 1908 Sportsman's Platform. This was an ethics code that was adopted by a number of hunter and conservation clubs in the years that followed. And various organizations, from the American Game Protection and Propagation Association, which was funded by a consortium of firearms and ammunition manufacturers, to the Federal Division of the Biological Survey, issued statements of support for buck laws and condemnations of hunters so greedy, callous, and unmanly as to shoot young deer and does. So the consensus had sort of shaped up by about the year 1920, and it seemed clear. Private conservationists, state game wardens, federal wildlife officials, and even firearms manufacturers repeatedly warned hunters that buck laws were necessary to save both deer and sport. In conjunction with other game laws and restoration efforts, the buck laws worked well, perhaps too well. Deer populations rebounded and in some locations quickly overshot recent herd sizes. This posed challenges for game managers and threats to deer food supplies. It was a situation that wildlife officials came to call the deer problem. The most dramatic early deer problem in the eastern United States came in the state of Pennsylvania, to the south of Vermont. Their deer populations erupted in the early 1920s in certain state forests, as the Pennsylvania herd, which had been nearly eradicated in 1900, just 20 years later approached 1 million animals. Pennsylvania's troubles were followed shortly thereafter by rapidly increasing deer populations in other places, in central Wisconsin and middle Michigan, as well as smaller scale eruptions in places like southern Michigan's George Reserve, Pisgah National Game Preserve in western North Carolina, and New York's Seneca Army Depot, and the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. This is a Wisconsin scene of overbrowsing following one of those localized eruptions. Altogether, these examples encouraged many game managers to reject the buck law as conducive to eruption and to encourage either sex or even doe-only hunting seasons. Worth noting as an aside here is that a vocal proponent of either sex hunts starting in the 1930s was Aldo Leopold. He served in that decade, in the 1930s, on Wisconsin's Citizens Deer Committee, an organization tasked with making recommendations on that state's growing deer problem. Officials discovered, often to their surprise, that many hunters vociferously opposed the removal of buck laws, which they had come to embrace as both effective and sporting. And so an ironic situation emerged across much of the eastern United States, as wildlife managers argued for broader and less restrictive hunting of white-tailed deer, and they were opposed by a range of hunters who sought continued restrictions. Essentially, the positions were reversed from what had been the case just a decade or two prior. For their part, game managers tried various arguments to convince hunters that they were not seeing the big picture when it came to the health of the deer herd. For example, they noted that forests could support only so many deer, with winter serving as the choke point in northern states where deer relied on winter feeding and bedding yards. So populations in northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, the northern half of Minnesota tended to congregate in these winter areas that were protected from the heavy snow but had access to food and water. So those became the sort of winter choke points. So in winter yard areas, does and fawns that were spared during the hunting season would still die in the winter if herd numbers outstripped yard feed in those months. Moreover, overbrowsing would hurt the future carrying capacity of the range, making the problem progressively worse each year. Game officials also questioned whether hunters really understood deer habits, from what they ate to how they reproduced. This was a poorly thought out tactic on their part, as it was bound to irritate hunters who prided themselves on being careful observers of wildlife. Game agencies also fell back on claims to increasing professionalization of their field, stressing the scientific studies that underlay their management advice. And they often highlighted employees' college degrees, their field research on deer, and their experience on the job, their time on the job, especially in the years surrounding World War II. For example, Missouri State Wildlife Magazine ran a regular column entitled "This Is My Job," explaining the work and training of conservation agents. Oklahoma's Game and Fish Department featured a similar Ranger personalities section. And Indiana invited hunters to meet your conservation officer. They also tried bait and switch campaigns, arguing that opponents of doe hunting must be tourists and sightseers, more interested in scenery and nature walks rather than true hunters devoted to proper herd management. So there was a bit of an effort at shaming at play here too, and that often backfired as well. Hunters sort of thinking they were being shamed in this particular instance. When these various tactics failed to produce public support, frustration often seeped through. As when Pennsylvania wildlife manager R.M. Latham, who was one of the leading national voices on the deer problem, closed his explanation of Pennsylvania's deer problem on a sort of bitter note of resignation. He wrote, quote, "It is for the hunters to decide whether their sport of the future and that of their children shall be based upon scientific study and management by well-trained wildlife men, or whether it shall be governed by the whims, fancies, and selfish desires of the deer hunters themselves." But hunter resistance to discarding the buck law was durable, and it took a number of forms. Many hunters expressed a fear that either sex hunts would quickly erase population gains that had been achieved under the buck laws. And deer hunting was better. The success rates were much higher in places like Pennsylvania and the upper Midwest than they had been at any time in memory. And hunters liked that. They were reluctant to do away with that. In letters to sporting magazines, they described attempts at limited either sex seasons, like Pennsylvania experiments in the late 1920s, by using terms like slaughter, massacre, and signing the herd's death warrant. And they argued that the state's deer problem was mere propaganda, in their words, driven by politics in the state capital of Harrisburg. In other words, they disliked scenes like this one on the screen, of either sex hunts that took large numbers of smaller deer. Many hunters reacted to these, finding them evocative of the bad old market hunting days that they had been told eliminated the herd in the first place, never mind the managerial intent behind them. Second, hunters seemed to have thoroughly absorbed the messages of sportsmanship as it was connected to a deer's sex. As a side note, this was probably only helped along in the early 1940s by pop cultural representations like Disney's Bambi, which very much played into this notion of proper hunting and bucks and does. Hunters often framed hunting does and juvenile deer as unmanly, unsporting, and even cowardly, Those were three terms that appear often in the literature. For example, Wisconsin's Save Our Deer program, a strident defender of the buck law, adopted the slogan, "Don't be yellow and kill a doe." And a student of the doe hunting controversy in the state of New Jersey summed up the hunter's stance in that state by saying, quote, "Only a coward, a weakling, a pervert would stoop to shoot mother." They even argued, hunters did, that the buck law made the woods safer by requiring hunters to be certain that they were shooting at a buck and less likely, therefore, to blaze away at anything that moved. Never mind that the same hunters who were willing to blaze away without being certain of a target might be the same hunters willing to violate other aspects of game law. And hunter arguments about the importance of hunting only bucks could become de facto policy, as some private landowners and hunting clubs remained buck only, even when the law permitted taking does, creating a sort of secondary landscape that remained under the buck law, even as state policies changed on paper. So there's a certain hidden landscape of hunting that develops here mid-century. Although it took a while, most states did loosen the restrictions of the buck law. By the 1960s, the vast majority of states with white-tailed deer permitted either sex hunting on at least one day of the hunting season. Only Indiana, West Virginia, Florida, and I think Rhode Island clung to the buck law. The deer hunters did not abandon the field when the buck law weakened. Per capita deer hunting climbed to a peak, actually, in the 1960s. In Michigan, for example, in 1968, more than 20% of the state's boys and men over the age of 14 were licensed deer hunters, with real participation rates almost certainly significantly higher still. Although game managers were able to institute doe hunting, many vestiges of the buck law mentality remain to this day. While most states permit either sex hunting, some restrict it to a portion of the season and adjust dates and bag limits based on herd predictions. In other words, buck hunting remains the default, with does serving as a variable. Hunters also cling stubbornly to the idea of the mature buck as the ideal prey, wilier and more worthy of pursuit than other deer. And various wildlife consumer goods, from mineral supplements designed to assist bucks in growing bigger racks, to doe in heat scent lures, to hunting video games that score kills based on antler size, target hunters who dream of a monster buck rather than a group of does the evening before deer season opens. So this sketch of the rise and reluctant fall of buck laws offers a few things to traditional histories of US hunting and conservation, I think. First, it complicates the notion that elites instituted a sporting ethic and game laws as a mechanism of class and in the South race control at the expense of limiting the commons. This is certainly part of the early story, but a large swath of deer hunters became the most ardent and lasting defenders of restrictive measures like buck laws, aligning them with their own values, even as a managerial class of wildlife officials became the most vocal critics of buck laws. And as something of an aside here, since hunter numbers steadily increased right through the heart of the more restrictive game law era to peak mid-20th century, that implies to me that the commons were never really closed, at least for hunting. Finally, even as buck laws fell to the wayside in the second half of the 20th century, the idea of trophy game and the most challenging and ethical hunting remained firmly wedded to older visions of bucks and does. So maybe in some, the story reveals that sporting ethics were hammered out by multiple parties in the 20th century United States and not implemented top-down thanks to the power of elites. Thank you for your time. That's the end of my presentation.
Our last but not least speaker today is Professor Mark Hersey of the University of Helsinki and Mississippi State University. And I think Mark's going to continue from where Drew stopped, because I mean he's going to concentrate on an area. With Drew's paper, we got an excellent overview of the history of the white-tailed deer hunting in the US, and with Mark's paper we're gonna go into the American South and more specifically to the state of Alabama, I think. And Mark's gonna talk to us with the title American Deerscape Toward a Landscape History of Hunting. Please, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Mikko. Thanks to all of my fellow presenters as well for thought-provoking papers. Mine overlaps with some of the other papers, especially with Drew's, in some obvious ways. But I'm going to take the subject of game management in a slightly different direction from the other papers, in that while I'm interested in the deer themselves for a number of reasons, what I'm really interested in today is the way in which successful conservation efforts reshape the landscape in ways that might call into question how that success is measured. And so basically we're talking about ongoing manifestations of what Drew talked about in his talk with the deer problem, right? We're going to get there. I'm going to gesture to a couple of other things along the way, but that's where we're heading. The bigger project explores a landscape history of the American South, particularly the physiographic black belt of it. There's a lot about this region that's really important for deer, from its subsoil to the limestone subsoil to the waterways to these prairies that marked it. Deer, of course, white-tailed deer are an edge habitat species, but I'm going to push past all of that and just note that it became one of the most iconic places in the American South, home to a plantation culture really that was almost without parallel, except maybe in the lower Mississippi River Valley in the antebellum era. It is no coincidence that the Black Belt of Alabama, where I'm going to focus today, was home to the first capital of the Confederacy. So the broader project traces that landscape's evolution over the longue durée, really. What we're going to do, though, basically today is focus on one manifestation of landscape. And so landscape can mean both the material world itself, and it can imply a sort of visual aesthetic. There is a sense in which the visual aesthetic factors into this chapter, but mostly today I'm going to talk about the material here. All right. So as a nod to Erki, I'll just note that I thought about talking about bass fishing instead. The Black Belt is home to, well, it's the home to the Bass Anglers Sportsman Society. So all the Bassmasters events owe their origins to this same region. This is a video game, the 2022 PlayStation version of Bassmasters. Drew probably has it for his kids. But the same guy, Ray Scott, who founded this, actually founded the Whitetail Research Institute as well, which is an interesting sort of thing. But I'm going to talk instead about whitetail deer generally. Whitetail are the most common deer of North America. How Linnaeus missed them in the 1750s, I don't know, but they weren't assigned a binomial Latin name until 1780, when the German polymath Eberhard August Wilhelm von Zimmermann assigned their current name, which is up there on the slide in his book Geographisch. He described them, by the way, as native to Britain, which I love because it's the middle of the American Revolution. And so by some measure, Virginia, although it's contested by the Americans, is still Britain. In any case, the first time they were called whitetail is actually by, at least if the Oxford English Dictionary is to believe, is by William Clark in his diary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. That's when they appear. But knowing Clark's personality, it almost certainly was in use before. Just going to admit this person. Almost certainly was in use before he used it. What matters for our purposes today is what happened to them. So the thumbnail sketch is basically this. Prior to the late 18th century, white-tailed deer had been a dietary staple of the indigenous inhabitants of Alabama and elsewhere. But in a now familiar story, the Native American nations of the Southeast got plugged into global markets for deer skins. There we go. Sorry, admit. Got plugged into global markets for deer skins, with the result that deer were seriously declining by the close of the 18th century. It's likely Alabama's deer population followed similar bubbles as those that marked other states over the course of the 19th century. with brief population booms followed by collapses. But in any case, they remained comparatively rare throughout the 19th century. Unlike some other states, which never had a moment in which a last deer was shot, Indiana famously, their last deer was shot in 1893, for instance. But by the late 19th century in Alabama, they were huntable only in isolated pockets. Indeed, they've been pushed to the very brink of extirpation. So when Alabama created a Department of Game and Fisheries and passed its first formalized hunting regulations in 1907, the best estimates placed the deer population of the entire state around 2,000, maybe 3,000, all of those in 3 counties. Unsurprisingly, many of those deer lived on land that was owned by timber companies, and given the nature of the department's funding, the Department of Game and Fisheries relied in no small part on those companies to police the game law. A few of those companies, a very few initially, began to cultivate their own herds of deer, importing the animals and then selectively harvesting lumber rather than clear cutting, and then planting browse of various kinds. The Allison Lumber Company is sort of the example par excellence here. It's located in Sumter County on the edge of Alabama's Black Belt. And it was probably the most successful of those endeavors. Beginning in the second decade of the 20th century, so in the 19-teens, it began hosting businessmen and politicians of various stripes for an annual deer hunt. A little more than a decade later, 1925, 1926, the state's Department of Game and Fish arranged to import 105 deer from Michigan, where they were released in the Alabama National Forest, situated north of the Black Belt region in the region's Piedmont. This is part of a broader effort to reintroduce deer to the state, one that would eventually prove perhaps too successful. But deer remained comparatively rare for several decades, as is evidenced by the fact that well into the 1930s, deer sightings were viewed as newsworthy events. It appeared in newspapers. But by 1929, the endeavor was going sufficiently well that Alabama's National Forest, today it's William Bankhead National Forest, opened a one-day hunting season. Really more of an event than a season if it's one day, but nevertheless, it was there. Several hundred people turned out. They weren't wildly successful. All told, 7 bucks were killed, but it still marked the first sanctioned hunting of deer on public land in a generation. So that's sort of the story as we go. Now, most of the hunting in the Black Belt took place on private plantations, partly because most of the land in the Black Belt, being former plantation land, was privately owned. Complaints about the un-Americanness of private land hunting notwithstanding, the number of private hunting clubs exploded over the course of the decade, the 1930s. Alabama's Black Belt proved particularly attractive, in part because the Allison hunts became a national phenomenon, and partly because the hunting was actually quite good, and in part because of its identity as a quintessential Southern landscape, which proved marketable. Also, really rich people bought land there. So the president of the Electric Bond and Share Company from New York, the president of the Pure Oil Company, Clement Studebaker Jr., the automobile magnate, and they were joined by their Southern counterparts, politicians, lawyers, doctors, and bankers. For a number of reasons, these clubs offered an appealing option. To begin with, hunters were more likely to prove successful killing bucks. So the annual Allison hunt in 1936, and the Allison hunt was invitation only, of course, saw some 150 hunters kill 60 white-tailed bucks. That number doesn't sound all that impressive, but if you contrast it to the annual hunt at the Alabama National Forest that same year, where there were 1,500 people who killed 16 bucks, it looks a lot better. The numbers clearly favored the private lands, especially in the Black Belt. These clubs also carried a certain prestige. This is the class thing that Drew was alighting in his talk a little bit. So the breakfast at the Allison hunt that year included tomato juice cocktails, grapefruit, sliced oranges, venison hash, little sausages, big ones, ham, bacon, cold roast venison, and the list goes on for 3 more lines. So they weren't exactly roughing it, but there was a measure of masculinity rolled into this, of course. And so we could spend a lot of time talking about that masculinity. I figured Drew was going to do some of this, and so I'm more or less going to skip it. It did involve this bucks-only shooting, of course. That's a policy that made sense at the outset and that got internalized, as Drew has shown. It also tied into, on these private lands, longstanding notions of Southern honor and identity. You can see a more conventionally class-based version of a hunting ethic than the one that Drew discussed here. But it was shared between fathers and sons at these plantations. It was the sort of way where shooting a big buck affirmed the people's position in society as the natural leaders of the state. It also differed in that they sought to tie lawful hunting to masculinity. Non-elite hunters, poor whites and blacks alike, often openly flouted the game law. And yeah, we want to plug it in, but we can't. We can, well, you would need to log in again. Your charger?
I have no charger.
Yeah, we don't have chargers here.
Main problem.
We're going to run
I
through.
couldn't know that.
In any case, jurors were reluctant to find men caught guilty of poaching guilty, or found caught poaching guilty if they were hunting for their family, etc., and that bothered the elite hunters. There was also a sort of paternalism in it that invoked precarious ties to the Old South. Given its cultural significance, few places offered a better circumstance to tie hunting to the Old South than the Black Belt, and that would continue well into the 1960s. And of course, there is the racial component that Drew talked about, or a little bit about. The private hunting clubs in the Black Belt went out of their way to recall basically slavery, but certainly the race relations. On the Allison hunt, for instance, black drivers handled the dog that drove the deer towards the hunters. Black guides tracked the wounded animals. Black guides processed the animals. African Americans proved vital to it, but they're invisible in all of the captions. They're in the pictures, but they don't appear really anywhere else. And of course, that invisibility flowed from a view of manhood that self-consciously excluded Black men. Public lands hunting didn't offer the same kind of affirmation, despite the fact that hunting there improved with the growth of Alabama's deer population. By 1940, all 67 of Alabama's counties had deer in them. Statewide, there were 14,000 deer by 1940. By 1960, that number had climbed to 100,000. By 1970, it had leaped to 400,000. The collapse of the cotton industry in the state, which happened to coincide with this rise, facilitated this deer boom. Cotton fields gave way to soybean fields and suburban sprawl, which are ideal habitat for deer, really, and the deer population exploded. Indeed, the Black Belt in the 1950s and 60s might have been the best place in the world to hunt white-tailed deer. Better soil produced more nutritious browse. There were much fewer deer per square kilometer than there are today. And the transition from cotton to soybeans, along with the calcium of the limestone waters, saw the Black Belt produce more than its fair share of big bucks. The record holder for the state even today was harvested for the Boone and Crockett measuring method, was harvested in the Black Belt in 1956. It also turned out that it was the best place to hunt. There wasn't any public land to do it in the Black Belt. So it's the best place in the world, maybe, to hunt white-tailed deer briefly, but you can't do it except on private land. As the population blossomed, the now antiquated don't shoot does policy hung on. By the time the state legislature reluctantly repealed its don't shoot does policy, the refusal to hunt does was so deeply embedded in the psyche of the state's hunters that they refused to do so. Many, as Drew suggested, still do. Charles D. Kelly, who headed Alabama's Game and Fish Division for almost 40 years, bemoaned the fact that he had to take Alabama legislators out into the field to see the damaged fields. You're looking actually at cedar browse here, and emaciated deer before he could persuade them to pass the regulation. They'd say, as he recalled, "My granddaddy taught my daddy not to shoot does, and my daddy taught me not to shoot does. I ain't gonna do it." It simply wasn't a manly way to hunt. By the end of the 20th century, there were some 1.75 million deer in the state, and predictably enough, they become something of a nuisance. And here's where the project gets interesting to me, because it's clearly a wildlife success story, but with caveats. So partly as a historian of science, this picture raises a really interesting question about how knowledge is created, about how proxies serve as evidence. No one has ever counted deer in the state of Alabama. There's no real incentive to do so, right? In many cases, it would be expensive and it would be contested anyway. So this overbrowse is an indication that there are too many deer. that the carrying capacity has been exceeded. What that carrying capacity is, though, changes year by year. So in Mississippi right now, there are more mature deer in the Delta than usual because a flood 2 years ago wiped out the young ones, right? Collectively, though, these proxies raise interesting questions for how we might successfully or define successful reintroductions. So over the last decade of the 20th century, there were more than 900 collisions between deer and vehicles every year in the state of Alabama, which is actually below the national average. This is an especially interesting proxy, I think, because these collisions could be attributed to other things, say the state's decision to plant ryegrass and clover alongside roadsides. Ryegrass and clover do grow quickly and prevent erosion, but they're also the same things planted on private hunting land to attract deer. In any case, the danger is announced basically every year, right? Nationwide collisions actually kill 300 people a year, hospitalize 30,000 in America. There are less visible proxies too, the proliferation of deer-proof plants, for instance. As those of you who garden may know, deer pose a real threat to garden. A real enough one that by the late 20th century, suburban homeowners increasingly found themselves favoring plants on the basis of their resistance to deer, rather than whether they smelled good or looked pretty. This shaped the landscape of the suburban South in 1,000 different corners, none especially significant in itself, but collectively enough to transform the plant species that people saw on a daily basis. And so what they identified as a southern landscape changed. So what does the southern landscape look like? Well, not like what it did 50 years ago. The introduction of deer literally reshaped backyards. These proxies raise questions about how to assess then the recovery of deer. How do you decide whether a landscape change is negative or positive? For some, it's straightforward. Deer were good. More deer, it's good. For others, deer maybe be a bigger threat to eastern forests than climate change. And for others, everything's just fine, right? You just sort of pick a number and say we're basically where that number is. Regardless, it's not clear that there's any incentive to do anything to adjust the population, even if it has exceeded the carrying capacity. There are as many Americans today who are adamantly opposed to hunting as there are Americans who hunt. And the former often like having a lot of deer around, a beautiful species. And they believe that the proxies used to measure deer herds reflect issues of management rather than ecology. So if there are a lot of car accidents, people should drive more carefully. If they're eating plants, people should fence their yards. Or maybe at the extreme, they should sterilize deer, not shoot them. But here's the thing, hunters also want more deer. There are 100 deer per square mile in parts of Alabama, and a lot of deer mean a lot of happy hunters. And because a lot of happy hunters mean a lot of people spending money, this ties into Drew's bigger project too, on hunting gear, then the state likes it, right? So the government doesn't have a big incentive to do much of anything. You can see that it's $1 billion a year business hunting is in the Black Belt of Alabama. One of the ironies, though, is that there were probably more deer than ever in the Black Belt, but the explosion of the deer population bolstered the fortunes of private hunting lands in the late 20th century. As the state began to run up against its carrying capacity, the competition for food diminished the number of trophy deer to be had on public lands. The closely managed private lands offer better browse, and in some cases, genetically modified deer, or more often the offspring of those genetically modified deer. Mostly these are bred or their semen is sold. So a different kind of deer farming then than what Victoria was talking about. But let me ask you to pull your eyes away from the enormous rack on the buck and to the fence behind it. And many clubs, which were often rebranded plantations in the 1960s, are fenced in. There are also many that are fair chase, of course. It's clear from the guest logs of these hunting plantations that many visitors find this circumstance a huge success. They get bigger bucks than the non-trophy deer available outside the private hunting lands. Moreover, these plantations allow them to affirm their regional identity and imagine a southern landscape and identity. The two are in fact of a piece in descriptions like this one. But whether a restored deer population constitutes a successful outcome for whitetail management seems far less certain. Thank you very much.